Hello and welcome to the Haaretz Podcast. I'm Allison Kaplan-Summer in Tel Aviv. The 3-hour meeting that took place between President Donald Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in the Oval Office on Wednesday was hardly a blip in the news cycle in the United States, but all of Israel was laser focused on the meeting between the two men. It was a hastily arranged visit. Originally, Netanyahu was supposed to go to the U.S. the following week, address an AIPAC gathering on the same week that the U.S. president is planning to have his first meeting on Gaza's Board of Peace, scheduled for February 19th. The Board of Peace meeting was supposed to inaugurate the entity and push forward the implementation of the second phase of the Gaza ceasefire deal and raise money for Gaza reconstruction. But according to the Netanyahu officials briefing the press, the Israeli Prime Minister could not wait that long. As we've seen over the past weeks, Trump is in a Hamlet-like debate with himself over whether or not to unleash the U.S. firepower he has gathered around Iran to attack, or use the leverage of that firepower and a weakened regime to force Iran to make concessions regarding its acquisition of additional nuclear capabilities. Israelis have been so fixated on the meeting and on Trump's debate that a parody version aired on the country's Saturday Night Live equivalent called Eretz Nehederet on the eve of that meeting. The comedy sketch showed Netanyahu walking into the Oval Office, beginning to cheer Trump on what looks like the U.S. president's plans to attack Iran. And then, suddenly, a Trump lookalike walks in, and the Israeli prime minister is encountering not one but two Donald Trumps. Startled, Netanyahu asks who is who. Unsettled and confused, he wants to know which Trump he is supposed to talk to.
We are going to kill a V too. Yes. Twice kill a V. Let's kick some ass.
Okay, yes. פשוט תן את הפקודה.
Not so fast, Netanyahu. I decided I want to negotiate for a deal with Iran.
מה זה? מי אתה?
I'm the peace Trump. I'm going to make beautiful peace. You gotta love this peace. And I'm the war Trump. I'm going to make beautiful war. I want my Nobel Peace Prize, Trump. I want my Nobel War Prize.
רגע, אני לא מבין מה קורה פה. אתה הבטחת לי שתתקוף.
It's not me. It's him.
אז עכשיו, עם מי אני עושה עסקה? מה קורה פה?
So what actually happened at the real Netanyahu-Trump meeting? And which Donald Trump will prevail in the end? I'll ask Haaretz Washington correspondent Ben Samuels, who covered the meeting, in our conversation coming up.
I'm Esther Solomon, editor-in-chief of Haaretz English. Around the world, the fight is on to preserve critical and independent media. Haaretz, Israel's oldest newspaper, upholds its long tradition of accurate, committed, and incisive journalism, refusing to bend its reporting to pressure from any government or leader. A digital subscription to Haaretz gives you up-to-the-minute news and analysis in English from journalists who live Israel's reality and are committed to covering the Middle East and its global repercussions. At the same time, your subscription supports the cause of a free press that holds the powerful to account in Israel and around the world. I invite you to become a subscriber to Haaretz now. Just go to Haaretz.com and use the code Haaretz10, that's Haaretz with the number 10, for 10% off an annual subscription.
Ben Samuels, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be with you.
Ben, I would love to ask you whether Donald Trump has made a firm and definitive decision as to whether or not to launch an attack on Iran and get a firm and definitive answer for you, but something tells me that's not going to happen.
Yeah, I wouldn't be holding your breath anytime soon, especially not after the meeting at the White House yesterday. And, this was their 7th meeting in the time since Trump has become president again. And each one of those meetings has had a certain element of pomp and circumstance to it, honor guard, flags, formal welcome, all that. This was not that. Netanyahu really kind of subtly and low profile came in through the back of the White House. It wasn't a filmed meeting. There wasn't the usual press spray at the beginning of the meeting or a press conference at the end of the meeting. And it was a very, high level 3-hour working meeting. And it really just sort of highlights the stakes of what's happening right now. And at the end of the meeting, Trump himself said nothing has been decided and that he, quote unquote, insisted that talks with Iran are allowed to be fully negotiated and allowed to be fully played out before they make a decision on potential military strikes one way or another. And, we're really kind of left where we were 24 hours ago in terms of where the Trump-Netanyahu relationship is, in terms of where U.S.-Israeli coordination is on Iran, in terms of where Trump is on Iran.
Does the use of the word insisted mean or imply that they were at odds and that they were arguing over it?
It's a little unclear because I think the policy that's coming from Trump himself is a bit all over the place. One day he will say that the talks are centered on the nuclear program exclusively and that a deal on that would be sufficient. Another day he'll say that, talks have to include Iran's ballistic missile capabilities. They have to include their support for regional proxy organizations. They have to include regime commitments to how they treat protesters, which is what almost sparked the military escalation last month in the first place. And, what you're seeing from Israel is a very articulated view that any sort of negotiation, any deal has to be all-inclusive. It cannot just focus on one of these elements.
What exactly do you get the message that Israel is trying to insist on?
Israel's insisting that ballistic missile capability and ballistic missile production has to be part of any final status agreement that Trump negotiates with Iran. That is a non-starter for Israel. Whether that's a non-starter for Trump, he maybe will say one thing one day, he'll say another thing the next day. And that sort of inconsistency has really trickled down to his top level of advisors who are the ones that are actually executing the policy. Marco Rubio will say one day that everything has to be included. JD Vance will say the next day that nuclear is what the talks are really about. Steve Witkoff is telling different things to different Arab nations that he's mediating with. And it's just very unclear where this is all going. And, part of this is intentional misdirection on Trump's part. But part of it is also just, very unintentional Trump doing diplomacy by the seat of his pants and by whatever whims are taking over him at that very moment. So on one hand, Israel and Trump may not be on the same page, but then 5 minutes will pass and they will be on the same page. And, we've been doing this long enough where we understand that every one of these meetings, there's a little bit of table setting where cracks of daylight are emerging and there may be disagreements in policy. But at the end of the day, Trump and Bibi are more aligned than they are not aligned. Whether or not that turns into a world war remains to be seen. But at the very least, the meeting ended as the meeting started, with Trump saying, we're in no rush. We want talks to play out. And if they fail, then they fail and we'll go from there. But talks are the acute priority right now.
Do you get the feeling from the Israeli side that Netanyahu, the Israeli military establishment, the Israeli leadership would really like to see an attack in place of this alternative of talks, and that sort of their backup position, because they have no choice, is to use what influence they have to get inside the talks and insist on the ballistic missiles and maybe on terror and the proxies, etc.? Or do you get the feeling that Israel might like it if a good deal, quote unquote, could be reached in the talks, that they would favor that resolution, or you can't tell at all?
There's levels to it. I think it takes nuance to say it because, last month, there are many senior Israeli defense officials and intelligence officials would have been the first ones to tell you that the pieces were not in place to respond to any sort of Iranian counterattack. There are other people in the Israeli government that believe that a decapitating strike against the regime is very much within the realm of possibility. And that is something that Israel cannot do alone, but something that the US and Israel can do together, and something that the US could possibly do by itself. Right now, the US is getting its pieces in place. They've been sending what Trump has been calling an Armada into the Middle East. There are more military assets that are going to be on their way in the coming days and weeks. Trump is not rushing this by any stretch of the imagination. Whatever element of we are going to do this now and we're going to do this imminently, that passed last month. Now Trump is really riding out the clock. And what he is prioritizing is having some sort of legacy defining moment. And whether that is some sort of diplomatic achievement, whether that is some sort of performative military strike that he can promote on the campaign trail out of the midterms, that's where he's at right now. He is not necessarily looking for an entrenched military conflict that compromises the global economy and compromises US military and financial interests. That is just not where he's at. The Israelis understand that. So right now, I think the dance is, how do we all make sure that we are as aligned as possible on how to handle Iran?
You mentioned the midterms. How closely is Trump paying attention to politics, especially in the Republican Party? How closely is he listening to his isolationist base, which is saying, do not attack Iran?
Well, the domestic politics are what undergirds everything for Trump. At the end of the day, for him, foreign policy is just a tool to fuel his domestic support. And he understands that voters, whether they are part of his base or they're part of other flanks of the Republican Party, or whether they're Democrats that can't stand him, they vote based on what is happening in America. And especially over the past few months, where affordability has just been validated through election after election after election of being the most important issue to Americans. They are really voting with their wallets in mind. They are not voting with Israeli-Iranian geodiplomacy in mind as much as Haaretz Podcast listeners may be interested in that. That is just not what is motivating the American electorate. Trump understands that whatever happens in Iran is just something that will be a bullet point under the general message that he's trying to promote. If it provides a negative distraction for that message he's trying to push, he will steer so far away from that. If it adds to this sort of mystique that he's trying to create for himself, that he is changing the world one day at a time through his peace through strength diplomacy, and he's doing it both at home and abroad, then it's something of use. So however that calculates in his own domestic political calculations, that's what's going to inform what he does.
It's like the Eretz Neheret comedy sketch. He either wants the Nobel Prize in peace or the Nobel Prize in war.
Right. And I mean, this is the kind of person that you're dealing with the president, where he, in the same Truth Social post, he will talk about how there is peace in the Middle East for the first time in 3,000 years. But then 30 words later, he's talking about sending the biggest military presence that the world has ever seen into this country's backyard and threatening to strike them. So, it makes sense in his mind that, he can sort of speak out of both sides of his mouth. But for most observers, they are inherently contradictory positions.
I believe the word that you used in your analysis, Ben, was schizophrenic.
That's one word for the policy that's emerging. Not for the president himself.
If we listen to Vice President J.D. Vance, the issue of liberating the Iranian people from their oppressive regime after their brave fight and being slaughtered in tens of thousands isn't even an issue really on the table in this decision, is it?
Maybe not, but maybe. That's the thing. If you ask Trump, it really depends on what moment you're catching him, or the latest briefing that he's got, or how he's feeling, or what time of day it is. There is no real consistency to what he's saying. And, maybe if JD Vance got on the phone with Trump 30 minutes before or 30 minutes later, the protesters would have been the number one priority. But at the very least, it's clear that the protesters are not holding the same consideration for Trump and in his calculus of what he needs to do in the same fashion that they were a month ago. That moment has passed where any sort of Iran strike would be motivated by defending the protesters against the regime, and for them executing protesters en masse and the massive arrests and the mass executions. That is just not what is pushing Trump anymore.
Ben, it wasn't played up at all by Netanyahu, understandably so, but there was actually a formal aspect to this visit, right? Ahead of the meeting with Trump about Iran, Netanyahu met with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and signed his official declaration announcing that he was joining the Board of Peace, which was informally announced quite a long time ago.
Yeah, and, this is just sort of the latest chapter of Netanyahu giving Trump a gift and kissing the ring. And, whether that is in the form of a framed letter nominating him for a Nobel Peace Prize or a model B-2 bomber or a model pager that was used in the Hezbollah operations, Netanyahu knows that the key to Trump's heart is to give him little gestures that really touch at his ego and touch at his heart. And the Board of Peace is no different from that. Never mind that he didn't get any sort of Knesset ratification for it or take it to the Security Cabinet and just made this sort of unilateral decision to enlist Israel in this exercise of ego of an organization. That's really all it amounts to. And it really plays into everyone's most base level of skepticism that Netanyahu would fully embrace this Board of Peace and assume that that would mean that the lives for Palestinians in Gaza would tangibly improve because of it. Trump is going to convene a meeting of the Board of Peace next week. It doesn't seem as if Netanyahu is going to be there unless he stays for an extra trip or unless he returns to Israel and flies back a few days later. But, this is another element of Trump's sort of schizophrenic policy. He doesn't really have a clear articulated vision of what has to happen next for the ceasefire to hold, let alone advance. And, on one hand, they're saying that Hamas needs to completely disarm and dismantle itself. On the other hand, maybe they are allowed to hold on to small weapons that don't pose a threat to the state of Israel. And it's unclear about which countries are going to commit peacekeeping forces. It's unclear what those financial investments are going to look like. Just having Netanyahu enlist himself unilaterally in the Board of Peace as like a gesture to Trump, maybe that appeals to Trump. Maybe that appeals to the most hawkish supporters of his, and that shows that there is like an Israeli buy-in to Trump's vision, but it's very unclear what that vision actually is, short of what Jared Kushner's Davos presentation looked like, which was just this complete fantasy land of AI and crypto and things that just bear zero reality to the genuine crises that people in Gaza are facing every single day.
Do you feel like there's some sort of quid pro quo happening? Trump has Netanyahu's back on Iran. If Bibi grits his teeth and goes along with the Gaza program, which he and his government can't be at all happy about. I mean, we're on October 6th, people are saying here. Hamas is in place, showing no signs of disarming. In the past, Netanyahu has said no reconstruction of Gaza before Hamas is disarmed. But when he signs onto the Board of Peace, as you said, without kind of any ratification by anybody in his government, it kind of contradicts all of that, doesn't it?
It certainly does. And, whether or not it's a formal quid pro quo or it's each of them, both Netanyahu and Trump, making these sort of internal calculations that I need a united front, I need this person on my side, because if they're not, that is going to cause me headaches at home. I think that is more of the primary calculation. Trump needs Netanyahu to not mess things up for him in Iran and Gaza. Netanyahu, for his part, needs Trump to not force his hand on either of these issues either way. And, it's one place where this can really come to a head is West Bank annexation after the cabinet advanced, universally condemned legislation that just really sort of entrenches de facto annexation as law on the ground. And Trump previously set this as a red line. Whether or not he's going to actually enforce this red line or just sort of have senior level administration officials leak on background that they don't support it while Israel continues at this unabated, that sort of status quo, quid pro quo peacekeeping thing that they have between each other, that may not hold. So I think right now the calculation is, okay, let's just stay out of each other's way, but present a united front as much as we can. And when we need to cross certain bridges on Iran or Gaza, we will. But, they can only take out so much credit before the bill's going to come.
While we in Israel were hyper-focused on this meeting, I got the impression that people in Washington, in the United States in general, were not particularly paying too much attention to it. Was that impression correct?
I think if this meeting happened 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, it might have gotten more of the lion's share of attention. I think people that are following foreign policy in general understand that, this is a little bit more of a big picture consideration than a thing that can change or spiral out in a matter of hours or days. At the same time, I think it just plays into that old adage that, all politics is local. And at the end of the day, the things that are at the front of mind for most Americans who follow Trump and who consume the news are, things related to the economy, things that are related to ICE and his immigration crackdown, things related to the Jeffrey Epstein files. And Netanyahu's meeting, the fact that it was just like such a standing business meeting, on one hand, it does kind of show just how much of a presence Netanyahu has become in Washington over the past year. On the other hand, that kind of works against Netanyahu's interest to like really play up these meetings as this sort of like historical landmark and legacy defining trip, because, it's just February 2026 meeting now. It's not like, okay, everyone remember that one trip that Netanyahu took to the White House. He's met with Trump 7 times in the past year now.
Here it was reported sort of with a desperate, urgent air about it. It was the urgent meeting that Netanyahu had to rush over and take. And again, he was supposed to go to a regularly scheduled visit in Washington next week and instead came now. So we don't know if it had a military air about it, if during those 3 hours they discussed, would the U.S. attack alone? Would Israel join? Might Israel even attack? And then the United States joined. Did it have any kind of a military flavor, this meeting?
I mean, they met for 3 hours, and there is a quote-unquote Armada in the Middle East and more military assets on their way. It would be naive to assume that there wasn't a military angle to this conversation. But at the same time, it just cannot be stressed enough that Trump does not want Israel to go at it alone. He doesn't, one thing that gets lost in the dustbin of history is that Israel did not have official U.S. backing when it began the 12-day war. Israel's initial strikes were met with complete U.S. disowning. Rubio issued a statement an hour after the first strike saying the U.S. had nothing to do with this. It wasn't until that this strike seemed to be successful that Trump decided to tag along and decided to, kind of backseat drive and say that actually this is something that we supported and something that they wouldn't have done without us. And by the way, it should also be mentioned that for all of Trump's bluster about completely obliterating Iran's nuclear program, the fact that Iran's nuclear program is still the key element for which these current negotiations hinge upon, that doesn't really pretend that the obliteration really holds that truthfully.
Speaking of the negotiations, are they happening? There was one day and then they were short and they ended. And we're talking about them like they're ongoing. Do we know where they're happening? Who's conducting them? Do we know anything about these supposed negotiations with Iran that are ongoing that Netanyahu rushed in to discuss the contents of?
Well, listen, there was the first round of official talks in Oman between Steve Witkoff and his Iranian counterpart. That doesn't mean that there have only been one round of talks. That just means that there have been one round of direct mediated talks. Senior U.S. officials are in constant contact with their Middle East partners. Iran is in constant contact with their Middle East partners and also with their sort of like mutual ally/adversary, frenemy kind of situations. Because the fact of the matter is no country in the Middle East wants a war right now, besides debatably Israel. And, if you ask any of the countries that are in regular contact with both the White House and Iran, whether this is Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Oman, any of these countries that are kind of trying to create some sort of diplomatic off-ramp, the motivating factor is that they want to keep diplomacy alive, whether or not this is like a small-term deal, whether it is focused on nuclear, whether it expands to include all of these things that Iran has said would be a non-starter for them and which Trump says are non-negotiable until they are negotiable. That remains to be seen, but there isn't a second round of talks that are formally on the books quite yet, but diplomacy is alive until it's not alive.
Do you think there's any chance Netanyahu will actually turn around and come back to Washington, D.C. next week? There was some speculation here that one of the reasons for the urgent rushed meeting this week was to give him an excuse to avoid the big Board of Peace inauguration gathering that Trump is organizing. It's supposed to be to talk about reconstruction, to start fundraising for reconstruction. And Netanyahu would have to have photo ops next to all these Arab leaders he'd have to defend when he came home. Or do you think that when it comes to Netanyahu, there's no such thing as too many trips to Washington, D.C.?
Well, listen, I think the photo ops might be as problematic, if not more problematic, for many of these Board of Peace members than it would be for Netanyahu. You know, I think if you are a Board of Peace member and you're trying to frame yourself as the savior of Gaza, then Bibi Netanyahu is the last person you want to be pictured with. At the same time, you know, originally on the schedule, Netanyahu was supposed to come for a gathering of senior AIPAC leadership, which is, you know, a closed door event that happens every year. It's not like the big AIPAC policy conferences of days past. You know, this is a closed press event that is like just meant for AIPAC's most senior advocates, lay leadership, what have you. And that was supposed to be the crux of Netanyahu's trip. Whether or not he comes back to address AIPAC, or he comes back for the Board of Peace meeting, or he does a satellite address to AIPAC, or he stays in Washington for over a week, which, you know, he has done in the past, where he's extended his trips to, you know, really squeeze the juice of everything that American capitalism has to offer. You know, it remains to be seen. But right now, it was clear that Netanyahu wanted to get ahead of Trump's negotiations with Iran. He wanted to make sure that it didn't go too far down a line where he could have less of a say of it than he wanted to, or that he would feel comfortable with. That was the primary motivating factor. Whatever happens with Gaza is secondary to that. Whatever outreach he makes to AIPAC leadership in terms of what he wants to lobby for is below that even. And we'll see what happens in the coming days.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for covering Netanyahu-Trump meeting number 7. We'll see if there's another number 8 coming up for you next week. He's by far, by a mile, the foreign leader who has met with the U.S. president more times than anybody else.
Yeah, we'll have to have a celebration of some sorts when they get to an even time.
Looking forward to it. Ben Samuels, thank you so much, as always, for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
And that's it for this episode of the Haaretz Podcast. Thanks to my guest, Ben Samuels, and to producer and editor, Adi Shacham. If you want to continue to listen to the podcast and never miss an episode, subscribe to us on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And please leave a comment and a 5-star rating, and that way more people can find us. And to keep up with all the latest news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, don't forget to subscribe to and follow Haaretz.com. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer, and until next time, shalom from Tel Aviv.